Do you know what the common ingredient is in both beer and wine? It's not water, because we both know that. It's not hops or yeast. Okay, it's actually hops and yeast. But more importantly, it's an accident. Yes, our favorite fermented beverages are here because someone didn't clean up their damn mess. And we can thank that very lucky accident for changing human history forever. So let's dig into how a happy accident led to the invention of both beer and wine. In today's episode, we are exploring how a lucky accident led to the creation of some of humanity's favorite beverages. Welcome to FoodSaga. Like, subscribe, and comment for more. Let's start. 8,000 years ago, people were just starting to farm grains like barley and wheat. And one day someone decided that grain was good to eat, at least if you ground it up. And they probably thought it was a good idea to save some for later. They put the grain in a vessel and set it aside for another day. And then that person went off to live the rest of their life never knowing that they had just invented storage. But the next time that grain was needed, it wasn't quite right. Something about it was just a little off. But since no one knew anything about the science of fermentation yet, all they knew was that it wasn't quite right. Maybe they thought a longer storage time would improve its quality, so they stored it even longer. The next time they checked, it was still not quite right, but it did seem a little better. Then finally, after enough time had passed, they decided it was ready. And they weren't just getting something that wasn't quite right, they were consuming something entirely new. This is the widely accepted theory on how the world got its first beers, and we have evidence to back it up. Researchers found traces of old beer, a Neolithic farming village in China that dates back over 2,000 years. The beer was sour and strong, not something that most of us would want to drink today. But it shows us that our ancestors were fermenting beverages long before they understood what they were doing. They may have started with grains, but that doesn't mean they stopped there. Did you know that modern apples don't taste like how they used to? In the 1800s, farmers favored apples that were more bitter and astringent. That meant that sweet, juicy apples were often left behind. But by letting those apples rot and ferment, the sugar in them turned to alcohol, making cider stronger than ever. Farmers took notice and began saving seeds from the most alcoholic apples to make the next generation of hard cider. We now call these apples cider apples, and while they aren't as popular today as they once were, there are still some varieties being grown. And that goes to show how much we have evolved when it comes to fermentation. Let's take a look at how the accident that led to beer and wine changed the world. First off, there's happy accidents. Okay, true story. When flour is left out in the open, wild yeast and bacteria can fall into it and start fermenting the sugars present in the flour. People started noticing that flour that had been sitting around was rising and expanding. At first, people didn't really understand what was happening. They didn't know about yeast. All they knew was that the dough was expanding, and that was good. As long as people have been baking bread, they have also been accidentally fermenting it. And fermented bread goes way back. Researchers found the remains of flatbreads in what is now Jordan that date back over 14,000 years. These breads weren't just left over from a picnic, though. They were actually buried with their owners. That shows that our ancient friends understood that bread was more than just food. It was something special. Fermentation also has a preservative effect on food, which is part of why people started using it. If meat or vegetables could be made to last longer, then it would be easier to survive times when fresh food was scarce. Of course, the accidental nature of fermentation meant that sometimes things went wrong. Meat could spoil or become rancid, and people learned which foods would ferment well and which ones wouldn't. Eventually, people were able to use fermentation to turn milk into cheese, make pickles out of cucumbers, and even produce kombucha from tea. All of these are foods that stay fresh longer than their non-fermented counterparts. It wasn't just food that benefited from fermentation either. Our friend who invented storage happened to also invent wine. When fruit was left out in the open, wild yeast fell into it and fermented the sugars in the fruit, turning it into alcohol. Wine was another drink that was so beloved by ancient cultures that they even made it part of their burial rituals. Archaeologists found an intact wine bottle in the tomb of an Egyptian pharaoh that dates back over 3,000 years. The Egyptians understood the value of wine, and they wanted to ensure that the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife was a comfortable one. After wine, beer was the second most common fermented beverage produced by ancient civilizations. While it's disputed where the first beer was brewed, there is evidence that ancient Sumerians were brewing beer as early as 1800 BC. In fact, there's a hymn to the goddess Ninkasi that describes the ingredients and process of brewing beer. While the goddess isn't the best example of a role model, her recipe sure sounds delicious. Of course, it wasn't just the beverages that changed. Over time, the process of fermentation became intentional. Instead of relying on wild yeast and bacteria, people started cultivating their own pure strains. That meant that they had more control over the final product and they could make it more consistent. It also meant that they could bring the process indoors, which helped extend the types of foods that could be fermented. While it may have been easy to ferment grains or fruit outdoors, it's harder to do in your home without any climate control. But with cultivated yeast, it became possible. Even today, many people make their own fermented foods at home. Now, it's not as common to bury them with us, but if you want to get fancy, you can buy special equipment to do it yourself. However, not everyone wants to go to all that work. So companies have popped up to make it easier for you. One company will ferment vegetables for you. You send them your veggies and they'll ship you back some fermented deliciousness within a few weeks. The company is run by two brothers who grew up eating their grandmother's kimchi, and they wanted to share that tradition with others. Their fermentation process is simple and traditional, and they use organic vegetables whenever possible. You can choose between a variety of packages, from a classic veggie mix to a package that only includes radishes and carrots. The company also offers workshops and events so you can learn how to ferment at home. Fermentation's influence on culture is undeniable. It plays a role in everything from religious rituals to social gatherings. But it wasn't until people started experimenting with fermentation that things got really interesting. People began adding spices and fruits to their brews, and some people even started distilling their beverages. Of course, the big players in the beer and wine industry don't want you to know about that. They'd rather you stick with the boring stuff. But if you're tired of drinking beer that tastes like dishwater, maybe it's time to try something different. Just remember, it all started with a happy accident, so don't be afraid to experiment and see what happens. You might just create the next great beer or wine. Or maybe you'll just create something stinky. Either way, it's all part of the fun. So how do you feel about the accidental nature of beer and wine? Do you think you could have discovered them yourself? Let us know in the comments below. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and leave a review. Thanks for watching FoodSaga. Like, subscribe, and see you next time.